So why is Baldur's Gate 3 such a good game and most other modern games miserably fail? So if you didn't know, guys, I've been working in the game industry for many years, right? And I've experienced with different roles, technical, designer roles, testers, whatever, right? And in this video here, I'm gonna explain another issue that the game industry has, right? And why they're so obsessed with making like sequels and the same thing over and over again. If you like the video, guys, please subscribe, slap on someone, hit that channel. And in the past, I have made two other videos, which are in my playlist here, of course, the modern games are soulless, right? But in those two videos, I was way more critical, okay? So if you see me angry, no, but I was very critical and explaining a lot of the culture issues, right, of modern gaming, why a lot of new games are terrible and so on. More from, again, like a mental standpoint, a cultural standpoint, and so on. In this video here, I'm going to be more technical, talk a little bit about the issues of game engines instead, and to some extent, this video will be more defending the game industry, because I will explain kind of how it works and so on, right? Give it a bit of my experience in the industry, and hope, to give some light, right, why a lot of games are like they are, right? So the reason I have the best Pokemon, of course, here in Mimikyu is to talk about Pokemon, right? So I made a very, very long video a few years ago. It was like 4 hours long, guys, okay? It was like 4 hours long, talking about the issues of Pokemon, right? And I mean from a technical standpoint, of course. So I won't go into it here. But Pokemon is probably the best example, right, of a really, really buggy game that still sells millions, right? Yeah. I think there's no other game at all that is performing so good as Pokemon. And still being, terrible. From a technical standpoint. And I want to point it out here, right? I like this game, okay? I played the game probably for at least 100 hours, right? I like Pokemon games. I like, breeding, whatever, get Pokemons, the perfect IV stats, all that fun stuff, right? But from a technical, from an engineering standpoint, of course, this game is utter trash, right? But I think it's a little bit, this is another video, but I want to point it out, that I think still the game is pretty fun, So that also, I think interesting, right? You can make a game from like an engineering standpoint that is really shitty, right? Like it's sort of bugs, technical issues, but it actually is fun to play, right? And that's a lot of videos, I suppose, but I pointed out. But anyway, the reason I bring it up, right, because in this video, I'll talk about engines mostly, right? The engines and the complexity of developing games are ever so growing, right? And I think a big issue why modern games are so forced into, like, we have to make more sequels is because I call the engine layer 1 and 2, or let's call them shells or whatever, like electrical shells. And so what I mean is that most games, right, are made in, like a game engine, like obviously Unreal, you can comment that later. But a big issue then, as in Pokemon, right, is when you have all this code and all the assets and all that, right, and you change that into a new engine, and then everything is just terrible, right, because you have to do everything from scratch. That being said, of course, and I've said it many times, like in my previous video with Pokemon, obviously Game Freak is notoriously a terrible developer, don't get me wrong. I mean, a Game Freak is like the worst developer in Japan, okay? And the matter is why, right? But still, though, in their defense, right, it takes more effort, right, to suddenly go into 3D, because you have to use a new engine, you say stuff and so on. And let me just explain a little bit what I mean here, and why I think that this is a big issue, right? So as I mentioned, right, Unreal Engine is the big thing right now. Also because of Unity, I have worked with both. I started as a kid, tinkering with Unreal 1. That's how old I am. Unreal Tournament, right? I played in a tournament, made my own maps and so on. You get the point. The first engine I actually used, or engine rather, but the custom map thing, was the Heroes of Might and Magic 2. That's kind of can guess my age there. So when I was a kid, I used to make my own maps, right, in Heroes of Might and Magic 2, 3, and 4 and so on as well. But it was in the second game when I started. But it was fun, you can make your own maps and so on, and that's kind of, how I got into it. You can sit down there and be like, I want to make a tree here, I want to make this castle over here, right? So what I'm describing to you guys right now is kind of like the level 3 part of game industry, right? Where you have an engine, but an editor, right? So you have kind of like Unreal Engine is the first layer, right, of an engine. And having, like here's about the matter, if you can make your own map very easily, that's an editor, right? That's actually quite a big difference between having an engine and an editor, okay? So most games doesn't have an editor, okay? It's actually quite much more work to make a video game. And what you have in between then is what I call the level 2 thing. So level 2 things today are visual scripts, right? Something like this. So it's way faster to develop video games using visual scripts in Unreal and Unity and so on, right? However, the issue then mostly, right, with new video games is that you have the level 1, which is the engine, like Unreal 7. The level 2 is to make all the code around that, and then 2.5 whatever is to make this stuff, and then 3 you get the editor, right? So most games, you basically, when the game is finished, you have the editor. Kind of like you had Here's Mathematic. When the game is finished, it's actually when you have the editor. So think about that, that's why I'm making a video here. So when you work on these video games, you know, you make the whole thing, you make a game and so on, right? You release the game, you very often still doesn't have an editor. And then in post-production, right, now you have, and then you might have an editor. But basically what I'm saying is that when the game is released, it just goes like 100 times faster, right, to make a new stage. So, to give this example, I worked in this strategy game a few years ago, right? It's made in Unity, and I was the lead designer, you know, creative director, whatever, right? And I also was technical designer. So I did all the scripts, like this, right? All the visual scripts, all the game mechanics, all that stuff, right? The developers, typically, you know, coding guys, right? They wrote the network coding and stuff, so on, right? And first, again, you have the engine, but they have to write, you know, all the code around it, right? And I need to do all this stuff, right? But for example, when you make one of these nodes, right, in your canvas, you can also then have macros, and so on. So for example, this game has, what is it, 66 units, I believe, on release. And obviously, when you have worked on it for like 2 years, 3 years, or whatever, right? When you're making a new unit, it goes faster and faster, because you're like, well, I can just reuse, you know, my scripts from the first unit, right? I can reuse my macro from, I made this hero last year, and I can just like take that macro. For example, we had this really complicated chain lightning. That's like a very intelligent AI pattern tree things, very, very complicated. But basically, me and the lead programmer, we worked for like 2 weeks on making that chain lightning. It was so complicated, we had to sit together basically and code that shit and do AI patterning, and it was absurdly complicated. A lot of math, and it was just, oh my god. But after those 2 weeks of creating that chain lightning, code basically, right, like the AI for that, then we had it, right. So then 3 months later, I have a hero that had a chain heal instead. Now we can just take the exact same code, rewrite a few parameters, basically the constraints on how the AI should, you know, look at it, and basically make it work in 1 day, right. So it's a massive speed up, right? The more you have worked on something, obviously. It should be kind of clear, but I think that IT stuff, especially gaming stuff, is quite different, right, you know, than from building like a bridge or something, right? Because if you're an engineer and you build a bridge, certainly you have your methods, so you have this one, but you basically, you know, you build a bridge as fast as you build a bridge, right? You build it by putting this block here, putting the Minecraft again, but putting that bit, right, you know, get that tool, you know, twist together, get the next whatever, right? You're kind of constructing it like that, and it doesn't actually go faster, you know what I mean? Like if you build, let's say, 10 meters of a bridge, the 10 to 20 meters are going to take roughly the same amount of time, right? Of course, you might, you know, say, develop new tools so it goes faster, different, you know, engines around it, right? Different cars, trucks or whatever, different cranes and so on, obviously. But most bridges are going to use the same ones, right? Because the next bridge might have thing of it. So of course you can speed it up, right? But in game development, it's more like, okay, it takes like, I don't know, a year to build the first 5 meter, right, of that bridge. And then the next 5 meter only takes a month. You know what I mean? Like it goes way faster. And then you can make 10 to 20 meters, like the last 10 meters then, only in a few days, basically, right? I'm kind of like overshotting it here. But yeah, point, it goes incredibly much faster when you have this stuff set in, right? So basically, yeah, the first 5 meters, right, it's kind of like you have to make the engine, as I mentioned, level 2, so doing the scripts, the macros, the code, the network, whatever. And then level 3 then, the editor. As I mentioned earlier, when I was a kid, right, with editors, the editors makes something go incredibly much faster. You can make a new state, a new map, right, in just a day or so, right, which usually you have to make maybe in a month. So for example, on the same game that I worked on, this strategy game, for the first half or so year, we didn't have this stuff, okay? We did not even have this stuff. So all the units, all the heroes in the game, we're not even doing them in like visual scripts or something. So I had to code them in like JSON files, okay? So if I wanted to like oh, this hero can throw a grenade, let's say 5 tiles instead of 4 tiles, right? I didn't have like a blackboard, I didn't have anything of this stuff to enter it. I had to write that in JSON files. It's a parentage. But for example, if I want to do a grenade attack, right, and it has to be an explosion, it has to be an AoE, then I couldn't just get a node and say, okay, this is gonna be like a flower, like, because if you have it in code, right, you have a script for that, you can use like a scale it, right? Oh, I want to have like a bigger flower, or whatever. No, I have to literally go in there in JSON file and write that. Oh, it should be this many pixels, this much bigger. I had to like manually go in there and be like, okay, it should be like 3 meters now. So that takes like a day then, right? But then you have this thing, okay, which is script, and suddenly you can change, like an AoE effect size or the range or whatever. Those very easy go-to parameters. Suddenly you can change that maybe in like an hour, right? Compared to like 8 hours. So it's massively faster. And then it basically was the same thing again when you have, like I said, the editor, right? Yeah, because the editor is kind of the same thing, but mostly for maps, right? Or bigger hit campaign and so on. So in the same game, for example, we had the CEO guy. He was working on the campaigns. So I helped him out with that, but he was mostly writing the code scripts for like the different campaign triggers, right? Like you open a door, here goes the elevator, spawn some enemies, kind of like this stuff, but for a little bit, compressed up, right? And it was never finished, I suppose, but basically, right, the more he works on that, the same thing there, because when he's written a macro for that, then we can reuse that, you know what I mean? Like, let's say you need to write the code, right, to get an elevator down, okay? And when the elevator goes down, it should spawn, like 3 wolves, right? Like to jump at you from the elevator when the door opens, okay? To write that code might take a month, right? But of course, obviously, when that code is finished, now we can use that every time in every stage, right? And then to have 3 or 4 wolves is basically just a parameter, maybe, right? It might be more complicated, actually, to get in like 3 or 4 wolves or whatever, right? But usually it's much, much faster. And then maybe I can take his code, right, with the 3 wolves from the elevator, and remove the wolf, right, the S of the wolf file, and the wolf AI, whatever, and let's have a tiger instead, right, which another AI, another behavior, another abilities, but obviously I can reuse kind of like the initial, elevator spawning thing, right? So it's really interesting how it works, I suppose, and that also, my long point is that's why you want to make sequels. And that's kind of what I'm coming to, right? Like I said, that's why you want to make sequels. So now you sit here and you have done all this. You bought the engine, right? You bought the Unreal, you bought the Unity, whatever, some other, Augur 3D, whatever. You bought the engine. You finished all the code around it, right? You did all those scripts, the visuals, the faster stuff, right? So now you basically have a finished game, right? And now you're starting, perhaps, to work on the editor. For example, the game I worked on, we never had an editor. So all that game, all those maps, I have written them in logical. Like, I used them in logical, like, notepad documents. Like, it's crazy, Like, basically, instead of having an editor, thinking about, whatever, StarCraft, here's whatever, right? You can draw the grass or whatever, you know what I mean? I have literally sat down and it's logically written every, like, hexagonal tile instead, by, like, manually, so to make the game work. It's very, very hard coded, right? Which, of course, means that it takes a lot more time to change that. You can say that was crazy, this game is pretty new. So, like, isn't that crazy? Yes, it was crazy. I, of course, wanted them to make editor, right? But, the owner of companies, we can't afford that. We can't hire developers to, make an engine, right? Or make an editor in the engine. So, the editor basically, as I said earlier, we started producing the editor when the game is finished, right? And obviously I have Call of Duty here because it's kind of the same thing here too, right? When you make a first COD game, when you make the first Black Ops game, right? That's kind of when this game is released, that's kind of when you have, like you say, in the editor, the level 3 engine, right? That's kind of when it's finished. So now it's like, well, it's going to be way easier, right? To make the DLC. Because making the DLC maps is going to take 100 times less effort than making the first stage, right? Because you can just use the editor. You have a level 3 engine now. So you're making a new stage where you made everything else before. Like my bridge example, you spend, now we're at 20 meter. So now we're just gonna make extra meters, right? We're gonna make a new bridge, basically. So it's gonna go incredibly much faster. And you can really see why, of course, companies wants to make the DLC stuff. I guess another comparison is that why are DLC so big for it? Yes, okay, so you can make a map 100 times faster in a finished game, right, than in the first 10 maps. Massive difference. In a fighting game, for example, then you have so much of the work is actually make everything work together, right? The code, the mechanics, the fighting abilities, the health, UI, everything like that. But each character is a modular thing, right? So adding a new character into an already existing working game engine, level 3 game engine, is incredibly much easier. Again, it's incredibly much cheaper to use a new character or a new hero in like a move, whatever. Obviously, it costs way less. And of course, reason why, for example, Riot Games is quite successful, right? Because when you made the whole base of the game, it's to add stuff into it, right? So it's even cheaper to add DLC, right? That you make a new game, of course. It's even cheaper. But that being said, now we're gonna make Black Ops 2, right? Now, of course, Black Ops 2 is gonna be tremendously much cheaper to make than Black Ops 1 because we can utilize a lot of the previous code, right? We have to improve it, maybe graphically, mostly asset file, optimize to run fast and so on, right? But especially a lot of scripts, they're actually the easiest thing usually to like reuse. I would say are usually stuff like AI and so, you know. Actually, yeah. Not say it's like a very intelligent AI according to these games. I mean, I worked in these games, I know for a fact it's very intelligent. But those scripts, like AI behavioral stuff, are basically the same, right? You know, you tinker them a bit, but it can be all be the same. So that's very again, that of course reusable, right? We can just take it again, right? So this is the whole backstory, right, of game industry. Okay, now then, let's be a little more critical. That's what I set the tone, right? Now, let's bring it back to modern gaming then, like Boss 3 and so on, right? That was kind of the long educational stuff there, right? But now, how then this affected it, right? So like I said, my earlier 2 videos were more critical on the culture, right? Stuff that is easy to change. I guess you call it soft stuff, right? And this is hard stuff. And I mean soft as in soft technique, hard technique, or whatever, right? Because culture is soft, right? Culture is something you can just change. I mean, you can, but I mean, technically you can't change it, right? But harder stuff, like, you know, tech stuff, math or whatever, right? This is an issue of, in the issue of math, it's an issue of hardness, right? So this is harder to change, absolutely. But I still want to explain it, right? And now let's bring up some of the effects of it. Of course, a big issue though, which of course I mentioned earlier there, where you can imagine pause is, yeah, of course you want to make deals here. Of course you want to sit there and spam out battle passes because it's so much cheaper, right? I think that's the main thing is like, why do you want to make money on DLC and battle passes? Of course there are 2 things. Microtransactions makes you way more money, right? Because of Kraken and waste and so on. I mean, obviously, so that's the one thing. But it's also so much cheaper. So the comparison, right? Like, why do you want to make monetization through micro stuff and DLC instead of making new games? Yeah, because not only do you make more money doing that, right? It's also way cheaper development time. Way cheaper. Not only is it cheaper from like a time standpoint and so on, and it's easier and so on, you can even fire a lot of people. So you can even fire them, right? So a game I worked on, I mentioned, you know, after I have, you know, done all the scripts, right, done all the macros, all the code, right, you can basically fire me, right, and actually replace me with like a junior developer guy, because he already has all my algos, right, you know. I had written all the mathematical algorithms, right, for that game, right. If you have them, you don't even need me anymore, kinda, right. Obviously I can use them faster and easier for me, but honestly, you know, when you have like a level 3 game ending, this would be an editor, right, you barely need a guy like me, right? Or you better need my skills, you know. You could have someone that is way worse than me at the job, right? And just kind of, you know, manipulating my previous work, right? Absolutely. That's also a thing too. Like you can replace the, you know, the senior developers for cheaper, right? But seriously, because ignoring firing people or whatever, right? Or, you know, reducing your man size or whatever, right? Reducing how many employees you have. But still, that's something you can do. You can absolutely reduce people, right? What you usually do, of course, is that you move the better developers, right? The smarter guys to speak. You move them to a new game, right? You know? Okay, now they finish everything. You have that like level 3 or even maybe a level 4 engine, right? That's finished now, basically. Now you can move those smarter guys, right, to the next game. And then you have much more junior people just working on, you know, sort of pushing out micro stuff, right? So it really can, because a very easy, cheap way, of course, to keep producing roughly the same stuff over and over again, because obviously it costs way less money, has less skill in it. So there's no wonder to me that why we are in this microtransaction hell, right? Because yeah, it is not only is it like more valuable from an economic level, it's also cheaper to produce and easier, right? because there's a difference between being cheap and easy. Like I said, it's easier too because you actually require less technical skills, less mathematical skills, yeah. So it's easier and cheaper, right? And you get more money. It's an obvious reason why I was liking that. And my second video, that was a few minutes ago, I thought about risk aversion, right? You know, game companies are very stuck in this route, similar to like Marvel and so on, and I guess DC or whatever, right? Where you're like, we have to make another Marvel movie, right? With roughly the same formula. And game companies are as well stuck in that, right? Because it's easier to make a Diablo 4 than to make a completely new IP, because you know people can buy Diablo 4 purely on, you know, brand recognition, right? To some extent, obviously. But you're gonna sell a few millions based on that as well, right? So it really becomes this like vicious cycle. This is the video too, because again, you have my first video, bad culture, right? Yeah. Terrible development culture. That's my video. Second video, you know, risk aversion, right? You get bonus sales because famous IP is on, right? You know, famous, a lot of fans, right? You know, and now here then they have the technical constraints of like when you already have a game or you want to make a sequel of a game, or whatever, you can reuse so much of the code or the assets and so on, and you can use, you know, worse developers, you can use worse graphic artists, you can have less skills too, right? So it really becomes this thing. Like I said in my other video, I think it also kind of comes back to that. It explains so much why, like EA dies or whatever. So when they make Battlefront and that, they really want to hire these people that can come in there and he's like, just keep doing the exact same thing what they're doing. Yeah, just keep pressing the same button, right? And you know, in the end, it unfortunately creates this soulless environment where you get very few games like Baldur's Gate 3, where you know you need to have a team dedicated, right, to making all the stuff flow. That being said, everything I said now, of course, is true. No, but I mean, I still have to defend, generally speaking, right, the you know, whatever, developers or the game engines or whatever, all that stuff, and even the companies to some extent, because in the end, though, it is how it is, right? If you make a new video game, it takes a huge amount of time until you suddenly can be way more efficient, right? You know, it's a massive threshold, and you hit those different threshold lines, suddenly you can produce so much more, right? So it also requires a lot of effort to get to like a decentable amount of like actual gameplay content, right? And if you have that, for example, you know, I like Street Fighter or fighting games, I think it's perfectly fine. I think it's perfectly fine with DLC, right? I have no problem with them dropping like new characters. Oh, we're gonna make Ed this next or Aki and then Ed so on this year, right? And then Akuma after that. That's fine, right? You know, you have the game finished, right? Now let's make more characters, you know, make some balance, so on. That's perfectly fine. So I'm not against DLC, right? In that sense, and I get it, right? But I also do think, unfortunately, from like a negative side, of course, it makes the companies yet again avoid making new ideas, right? Yeah, because even if you want to make a new game, it's much cheaper to just reproduce the same where you have it from a technical standpoint. That is unfortunately how it is, right? That being said, I want to point one thing out here, like an offshot point, and leave a comment below, guys, if you guys think about this thing. But I said it on Twitter, my Twitter rants now. But I think one thing though that annoys me, I'm talking about specifically Baldur's Gate 3, right? It's a lot of people that attacked the fans or whatever of Baldur's Gate 3 when they said like, oh, blah 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 blah, and these companies and they're so many and so on. I think one fix, right, for this like content, the game engines, the productional, the thresholds or whatever, right, to make better games. I think an obvious fix of that, and I say it again, is to have less game companies. And with that, I don't mean we should have less developers or less artists, whatever. I mean that I don't think it's a good thing that most people, right, actually were angry at Baldur's Gate 3, were actually a lot of indie devs, right, you know. Some big devs too, but a lot of like, you know, random people working on some game you haven't heard about. And if all the people that made one game together, right, they might make another Baldur's Gate. Yeah, it is not a very good thing, I think, that so many people have this like tiny little studios, and yeah, obviously gonna make kind of meh games. And I guess you could somehow say that. What do you guys rather have, right? Do you rather have a few good games per year or a lot of shit games? Yeah, I think everyone rather have a few good games, right? So I do think it's a big issue in the industry itself. It takes a lot of time to make a good game, right? To create the standpoint settings, the code assets, all that stuff, right? And obviously then, if you have 500 tiny studios all trying to produce tiny content, and again, a threshold to get somewhere is a lot in the beginning, right? What if them all together to make one game? Then you get one great game instead, an obvious solution to it. And I think it's like, that is to me a big issue. I'm not against indie or whatever, but I think it's like a big issue that there's so many, you know, you just flood, right, of terrible games being made, where if people instead made one game together, they actually probably make like 1 or 2 good games. At the end of the day, right, time is a finite thing, right? I and you and so on, we can only play so many games, so many hours per day, of course, and there actually is no point producing a lot of meh products instead of making one good product, right? Like, what's the point of that? But anyway, guys, hope you liked the video, subscribe, like button, and have a great day.